So one of my favorite channels on YouTube to watch is actually Sargon of Akkad. Much of what I'm doing on this channel, I would say, has been inspired by the way in which he engages with various topics, bringing philosophical nuance to and thoughtfulness to culture, current events, politics, geopolitical events, all of it. So from time to time, I do check in on his channel and I watch his content. Also, it's very unnatural for me to call him Carl. I know he doesn't go by Sargon. That's the name of his channel. Perhaps if I get the chance to meet him and shake his hand one day, I will feel comfortable referring to him as Carl. Until then, Sargon. Sargon made a video called "We Need a New Narrative," which in a very interesting way to me is I don't know how to say it, because he both yearns for a Britain that no longer is, but in asking for a new narrative, he almost hitches his wagon to a new modernity to come. I don't think he would ideally commit to that, but in asking for a new narrative, I would argue that the narrative isn't sufficient, because a narrative cannot give you a sufficient cosmology, teleology, ontology to order our lives, both at the individual level and all the way up through the political lives of rulers. I think you have to go further, and we need our old myth. Now, when I say myth, understand that I am not saying it is not true. I am saying that it is a story of such a grand scale that we derive those things from it. Our origin, our cosmology, our teleology, our ontology. It informs everything that we are and everything that we do, and it orders society in a very real way. And I think apart from the myth, we don't have the ability to come out of Spengler's winter. So Sargon makes reference to two authors. First off, he makes reference to Alasdair MacIntyre in After Virtue, I believe was the name of the book. And MacIntyre talks about the need for stories for life to be meaningful. He also references Oswald Spengler. Spengler posits that civilizations follow the pattern of the seasons, and that there's a birth of spring, there's a time of fruition and abundance in summer, there is an autumnal maturity, and then there is a death in winter. Now, what I would say is, I would say Spengler's analysis, first and foremost, is not a new thing. It's really taking the Wheel of Fortune, which Sargon has covered before, but that you see in authors like Boethius and his, what's the name of the work, The Consolation of Philosophy, and applying it at a civilizational level, and that there are these seasons that pass through. I think the four seasons metaphor, if you only see death and winter and you see no overarching purpose through history, you see no meta level story being told, then yes, all of this is purely contextual, including the stories. They have no independent value. Their value is their ability to preserve the society, and when that society dies, those stories die. I I think that only happens in secularized societies, though, because secularized societies do not have an enduring myth. They have a narrative. And I think that's the short-sightedness of asking for a new narrative. So let's talk about the post-Enlightenment West. What the Enlightenment did was it took Christian virtues and it divorced them from their context. They no longer had a transcendental grounding. They were seen as virtuous because they aligned with what those thinkers thought of as virtuous, because they were products of a Christian time. As time goes on, that identity of the good and the virtuous has continually eroded in secular countries. The mooring lines, which kept civilization tied to virtue, have been chopped. And we find ourselves generation after generation set more and more adrift in the river of history. Without the myth, there is nothing to pull us back, because as we see in our own context, the unifying identity erodes. It is entropy. It is dying. And nothing within human creation can revive it. That is why the winter of death is the inevitable outcome. If you were to take, for instance, the Soviet Union as a case study, the Soviet Union didn't even bother preserving its pre-Soviet, pre-Bolshevik virtues. It redefined virtue whole cloth in service of the state. And it ran its course in about 80 years to a point where it could no longer sustain itself and was forced to collapse under its own weight. Meanwhile, stepping back and looking at Russia as a whole, the core myth of Russia, Orthodox Christianity, and understand, when I say myth, I'm not saying it's not true. I am saying that it is the story from which we derive the greatest meaning, the truest meaning. That myth has brought Russia back into spring. Bolshevism was a dark, dreary winter of death. And yet Russia, because of its myth, has been able to rise from that. Now, Spengler also brings up a group of people that he calls the Fellahin. This is the post-historical man. This is the man who, I think he describes it as living at basically almost a zoological level. He has no regard for civilization or for culture or anything. I think that this is what happens when the myth is preserved within a community, a subculture, even arguably a counterculture, yet the rest of the society leaves that myth and moves on to either a new myth or a narrative. It's ironic because my understanding is that Fellahin is the Egyptian word, yet the community that comes to mind that would qualify as this are the Copts. The Coptic Christians in Egypt, in many ways, have been left behind by their society at large because they persist as an Orthodox community in an overwhelmingly Arab Muslim nation, not Arab, Muslim. The two aren't the same. All right. They persist in an overall Muslim nation. They have seen fierce persecution, and they have persisted since the Muslim conquest of Egypt, which was very early on in the history of Islam. I think that this is the other possible outcome. When the culture at large, when the civilization departs from that myth, and yet that myth is preserved within a community, you end up with a group that is checked out from the wider civilization and yet committed to their own values, their own teleology, their own cosmology, their own ontology, their myth. And it reminds me of a quote from St. Anthony. And St. Anthony the Great, this is one of my favorite quotes. I have no idea why, but it is. He says, a time is coming when men will go mad, and then they will see someone who is not mad. They will attack him, saying, you are mad. You are not like us. In the instance of those communities which have preserved their core myth and watched it erode or change in the greater civilization, yes, the charge stands. What do we do with this? Well, first and foremost, I think we say that a humanist narrative will not be sufficient to save Western civilization. A post-humanist narrative will not be sufficient. A post-Enlightenment narrative will not be sufficient. A post-liberal narrative will not be sufficient. We need our myth. We need the one true myth. The myth that tells us the truth in a way that nothing else can. We need Christianity once again. And apart from it, I'm not sure that at a sociological level, you can stave off Spengler's winter. Anyway, leave it in the comments section. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.